the UK has been very, very uncooperative with that stupid island that they have.
Why is Donald Trump so interested in a tiny group of mysterious islands in the middle of the Indian Ocean owned by the Brits? And why is their fate now the center of a major diplomatic row?
This is not Winston Churchill that we're dealing with.
The UK had a plan to give these islands up. In fact, it was years in the making. But then in January, President Trump took to social media and posted that for the UK to give these islands up, it would be an act of great stupidity.
I think they should keep it. I don't know why they're doing it. Do they need money?
The deal now seems to be on pause, so what happens next is anyone's guess. But at its heart, this is a story about two competing visions for how the world works. From the BBC, I'm Asma Khalid in Washington, D.C., and welcome to The Global Story.
My name is James Landale. I am the BBC's diplomatic correspondent, which means I cover foreign affairs and international affairs.
Well, it's in that vein that we wanted to have you on the show today because you've been covering international diplomacy for many years here at the BBC. We wanted to understand what's actually going on with the Chagos Islands, a place that I confess I knew very little about prior to the President of the United States chiming into this conversation. So, James, could you sum up the recent diplomatic row for our audience? What is the crux of this about?
Okay, so the Chagos Islands are a bunch of islands in the middle of the Indian Ocean, and they are owned by the United Kingdom. They're British, or are they? Because not everybody agrees with that statement. The Mauritians, an island a little bit further away, a bit further to the south, they believe that they own these islands and have been making the case for that for some time in the international courts. Now, the reason that Donald Trump is interested is because these islands contain a real issue of US national security. And Donald Trump has said different things at different times, but at the moment, he opposes a deal that the Brits have done with the Mauritians to hand the sovereignty and control of these islands from the UK over to Mauritius. And that's where this dispute comes from.
Got it. And that deal is now on hold, my understanding is, there in the United Kingdom.
I think it's on hold until the United Kingdom can work out precisely what the position of the United States is and what Donald Trump ultimately wants to do.
So take us back to where the story began for our purposes, which is when and how the UK came to own the Chagos Islands.
Well, the reason the UK has the Chagos Islands is because we won in the Napoleonic Wars. We defeated Napoleon's forces. The British Navy seized various French possessions in the Indian Ocean. So they were in British hands all the way until the 1960s, when Mauritius got its independence, along with so many other former colonies around the world. But when independence came, the deal was this, that Britain would hand over sovereignty to Mauritius. It would gain its independence, but it would carve off these Chagos Islands and turn them into a separate entity called the British Indian Ocean Territory. And the British kept control, and Mauritius was paid a substantial sum of money by the Brits in compensation for taking the Chagos Islands.
Okay, so then how do you go to a moment in which the United States first becomes involved with these islands?
Well, here we get into slightly murky history. But the broad consensus is that the United States was heavily involved from the start because the Americans had, as the British did, a desire to use these islands for a particular purpose. So they said, right, OK, we will keep these islands. And on the biggest one, an island called Diego Garcia, we'll build this military base, which they built during the late 60s and early 70s. But, and here's the rub, during that process, they forcibly evicted several thousand Chagosians, people who actually lived on those islands, and they were moved either to Mauritius or to the Seychelles, an island nearby, or some of them came to the UK, where there are still several thousands living in southern England.
And to be clear, this is a U.S. military base that was built in the 1960s?
It is technically a British base.
British base. Okay.
The Brits own the real estate, and they pay for that. But the Americans pay for the running costs.
Okay, so if one of the Chagos Islands, Diego Garcia that you mentioned, has been used as a military base for the last several decades, why is the UK on track to give these islands up?
Because the island of Mauritius has long argued that the deal it signed up to in the 1960s was unfair, and that actually the Chagos Islands are legally owned by Mauritius, they argue, and they have taken that case to the international courts. And in 2019, the United Nations highest court, the International Court of Justice, ruled in a non-binding advisory opinion that the continued British occupation of those islands was illegal, and they ordered the UK to hand it back to Mauritius. That opinion was then supported by a full vote at the United Nations General Assembly. And since then, the British government has negotiated a treaty with Mauritius to hand sovereignty over. And that has now been agreed between both countries, but it hasn't been ratified in the British Parliament yet. So it hasn't actually come into force yet.
In October of 2024, the British government officially agreed to hand these islands back to Mauritius. And James, can you walk us through what's actually in this deal between the UK and Mauritius?
So, as you say, the deal was that the UK would hand the Chagos Islands back to Mauritius. They would have sovereignty. But, and here's the key but, the UK would lease back the Diego Garcia military base for 99 years. In practical terms, nothing would change, apart from, Mauritius would technically be in charge of these islands. But the deal was, OK, the Brits keep control because they get a lease on the military base. And what that does is that clears away all the legal threat. And in return, the UK will pay Mauritius a substantial amount of money.
When that deal is announced, remind us how the United States reacted. I will say I don't remember it being a major storyline here in the U.S., and I was covering the White House at that time, but there was a little sort of statement, it seems, of support from the Biden administration.
Yes. The Biden administration wanted this deal. They are the ones who encouraged the Brits to start the negotiations. When the deal was finally agreed, the Americans pored over that deal with a toothpick, and they came out the other side saying, yeah, OK, we, the US, are happy with that. And this seems to work.
So as we said, this is happening in October of 2024. It is just ahead of the U.S. presidential election. You say that the deal was supported there by the British government. It seemed to have support here by the American government as well. Why not just ratify it at that moment?
Two factors. One was that one or two Republican politicians had cast the odd doubt about the deal, had raised the odd question. An election was imminent in the United States, and the Brits did not want to sign off on something that was then would then be opposed by the next administration.
When the Trump administration has a chance to assess the situation, how did they initially react?
Well, the initial reaction was, OK, this is what the Brits want to do. We seem pretty happy. And if you remember, in an early meeting between Prime Minister Keir Starmer and the President of the White House, it came up.
On Chagos, Mr. President, Keir Starmer has signed the deal to give away the Chagos Islands to Mauritius. Will you approve that deal?
Well, we're going to have some discussions about that very soon, and I have a feeling it's going to work out very well. They're talking about a very long-term, powerful lease, a very strong lease.
So, James, help me understand why the President of the United States is so interested and so involved in a very small island that is very far away from the United States.
The answer to that question is because this is not just any old military base. This is a supremely important military facility for the United States. And it's a unique facility, a unique asset. And I think that's why Donald Trump has got involved. He has a lot of people in the US military security defense world who will be telling him just how important this island is.
I want to ask you more about the military significance of Diego Garcia. One of our producers pointed out that Ben Judah, former advisor to the former Foreign Secretary David Lammy, said in the Times of London, I'm going to quote him here, he said, "Once you've been briefed, even partially, on what it does, the information gives you vertigo. That suggests there's a lot going on there. Are we talking nuclear weapons?
There's a huge amount that goes on there that we simply don't know because it's a military base and everything about it is classified. Whether or not there are nuclear weapons stored there or not, I do not know, but I do know that it has become an issue that some critics of this deal have said that if the Brits hand over sovereignty, then the Mauritians could potentially ban the storage of nuclear weapons. The assumption, the point that some people have made is that there's a possibility that nuclear weapons have been stored there.
What specifically happens at this military base?
So, first of all, it's like a sort of an immobile, enormous aircraft carrier in the middle of the Indian Ocean, a place where you can land big, long-range bombers. The kind of bombers that the United States, Donald Trump, sent to bomb Iran last June, you can't land those bombers on an aircraft carrier. If you can have those bombers based on Diego Garcia with its long airstrip, you can have American bombers deploy their weapons and their bombs throughout this part of the world, the Middle East, parts of Asia. So there's a straightforward, you can get planes there and deploy them from there that you can't do elsewhere. Secondly, it is a deep water port. So a massive maritime hub for American naval and other shipping to go in there. They can refuel, they can get more weapons. It is also a surveillance station. This is a place littered with satellites and all the rest of it. During the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, Diego Garcia was a place from which America deployed a lot of its forces into the region. And strategically, militarily, what it does is it gives the United States a stepping stone to the Indo-Pacific.
Okay, James, I have a clearer sense now of the Chagos Islands' significance from a national security perspective. But I still want to sit with you a bit on the politics of this all, because President Trump himself only started raising concerns about this deal this past January. Can you walk us through how his position has evolved?
As we said at the beginning of last year, he signaled that he was fairly relaxed about it. Then, as you say, in January of this year, we got one of the first Truth Social posts where he criticised the deals. Now, the key thing to understand is when this happened. This happened during the controversy over his desire to take control of Greenland in the Arctic. Now, at that time, the Brits, along with other European nations in NATO, were all saying, no, you cannot do that. So there was a sense, certainly from the European side of the fence, that this was Donald Trump using the Chagos Islands issue as a way of lashing out. Then, of course, what happened was, a lot of worried telephone calls between the UK and the United States. And then Donald Trump stuck out another post on Truth Social at the beginning of February saying, well, look, I've had some conversations and I think this is, quote, the best deal that Keir Starmer could make. So that was Donald Trump sort of back on the even keel. But then, within just a couple of weeks, Donald Trump issued another social media post in which he again criticised the Brits, saying you can't rely on a lease.
Yes, he does not seem to be supportive broadly of leases, yes.
But crucially, what he does is for the first time, Donald Trump links the Chagos Islands to his desire to threaten Iran militarily. And the president says, and I'm quoting here, should Iran decide not to make a deal, it may be necessary for the United States to use Diego Garcia and the airfield located in Fairford, that's in the UK, in order to eradicate a potential attack by a highly unstable and dangerous regime, an attack that would potentially be made on the United Kingdom. And it subsequently emerged that the Brits had been voicing concerns to the Americans about the legality of any attack on Iran. And the Brits had said, we don't think that attacking Iran now would be seen as self-defense, and therefore we're not sure that the United States can use Diego Garcia to launch an attack. Because of the disagreement over the legality of attacking Iran, again, Donald Trump has changed his position on whether or not the US supported the transfer of sovereignty of these islands to Mauritius.
James, I think it is a fair assumption that President Trump has expansionist ambitions. Many people might have sort of glossed over initially the headlines when they saw the Chagos Islands, thinking, oh, yet another territory. He's had his eye on Greenland. Perhaps this is a similar story. And I will say I am kind of intrigued that he was ever supportive initially of this deal.
The rationale for the deal is this, that if international law says that the UK is illegally occupying these islands, then, and potentially there's a risk that an advisory opinion becomes a legally binding one. At that point, the UK becomes illegal occupiers of land. For the Brits, there's a geopolitical risk. If the UK is seen to be an illegal occupier of what is effectively a slice of Africa, that damages UK relations with many African countries. It damages many UK relations with countries across, the global south or the developing world. It also makes it really hard for the UK to say to Russia, it is wrong for you to illegally occupy parts of Ukraine.
So it's a moral argument.
There's a moral argument that the Brits are involved with as well. Then there's the risk of, if there's a legal uncertainty about it, at that point, Mauritius says, you know what, we're not getting a deal, we're not getting cash, we're going to look to China. If there were no deal, so the argument goes, you could get a Chinese fishing fleet. Then potentially you could get maybe a research base set up by the Chinese, and then maybe a listening station, all with just a few hundred miles of a massive American airbase. As part of the British deal, there's a buffer zone around all of these islands that prevents the Chinese forming any kind of establishment there. The critics, of which there are many, say that instead of actually retaining some control over what goes on under this deal, you are essentially opening the door to greater Chinese involvement because of past Mauritian engagement with the Chinese.
So you alluded to this earlier, James, that there were people who were living on the Chagos Island on Diego Garcia. They were forcibly removed. What do the exiled people who used to live on the islands, what do they think about all of this? What do they want?
They have different opinions. They do not have a united voice on this. Some of them want the islands to remain British, others do not. What has, I think, does unite them is a sense that they haven't really been listened to as part of this process. And I think that sense of injustice that has been perpetrated against the Chagosians is one that will continue regardless of who technically has sovereignty over these islands.
A lot has happened since that conversation with James a couple of weeks ago. Mainly that the United States, alongside Israel, did in fact start bombing Iran. And so earlier this week, I called James back, and I began by asking him about the UK's response to the war and what it means for Diego Garcia.
Well, the British response to the plan and the actual attack by the United States and Israel on Iran was initially very, very cautious. There were many people within the British government who considered that to be against international law. They did not participate, and they did not want the United States to use British bases to launch any kind of attacks. So in the initial phase, the US was not allowed to use UK air bases for those long-range bombers.
You say initially, so that changed over time.
Well, it changed almost immediately because once the Israeli and US attack began, so too came the Iranian response. And at that point, the Iranian response involved threats to UK interests, UK nationals in the Gulf and elsewhere. And at that point, the British government said, right, we believe it is legally acceptable under international law to allow our bases to be used to make defensive strikes against places where Iran's ballistic missiles are launched from and targets like that. And at that point, the British government said, right, in that context, if the United States wishes to use UK bases, i.e. Diego Garcia, they can do so.
So do you have confirmation? Has Diego Garcia been used now in this war?
Well, we don't know yet. It's possible, but at the moment, we don't know definitively.
So, despite this change of heart, change of policy, whatever you want to call it, that the British Prime Minister had, it appears that the American president, Donald Trump, has not been impressed by the UK's actions thus far in this war. And he's certainly not been impressed, it seems, with the British Prime Minister.
Yeah, no, Donald Trump has expressed his substantial displeasure with the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, even saying he's no Winston Churchill, a reference to the famous British wartime leader. Who, he became aware that the British weren't allowing the use specifically of Diego Garcia. He dismissed it as that stupid island. The president, as ever, sometimes it's press releases, sometimes it's news conferences, but then, as ever with Truth Social, on the 7th of March, put out a post saying that the UK, once our great ally, perhaps once the greatest of them all, has finally given serious thought to sending one of its aircraft to the Middle East. That's okay, Prime Minister Starmer. We don't need them anymore, but we will remember. We don't need people, that join wars after we've already won.
James, how do you see the war in Iran affecting the future of a deal over Diego Garcia? And the reason I say this, the reason I ask you this, is because it is notable that Trump's first criticism of the UK about Iran specifically mentioned, quote, that stupid island.
As we know, Donald Trump has blown hot and cold on this deal. The inability to use Diego Garcia at the beginning of this conflict probably has further hardened his opposition to the deal. The ratification of this deal between the UK and Mauritius is on a pause until the UK can get some greater clarification from the Americans over this. I don't think they're going to get any clarification from the Americans until the Iran conflict has come to some kind of resolution, or at least has diminished in its intensity.
How has all of this affected the relationship between Starmer and Trump, between the US and the UK? And I'm curious to understand from you what it tells you about the differences in how these two leaders, Starmer and Trump, see the world, how they see power, how they might see international law.
I don't think you could find two people more different in their way that they view the world and the way that power should be deployed. Donald Trump believes in the use of power simply on the basis of the United States national interests. He is very, very dismissive of international law. By contrast, Sir Keir Starmer is a lawyer. He is somebody who has spent his life involved in upholding the law. And Sir Keir Starmer has made it very, very clear that he believes that international law does still play a role. So I think what we've seen with both Iran and with the Chagos Islands issue is essentially a pinch point for the UK, because it's forced them to make a decision between these two competing ideas. On the one hand, you have this idea, this thesis now, the world is now basically decided by men, powerful men, in contrast to the sort of the old idea that actually we resolved our differences collectively through an international system, through international law, and at the United Nations. And I think what the Chagos Islands has done, and also to some respect the issue of Iran, is it's forced the British government to kind of make a choice that it perhaps didn't really want to do. The problem is, as it's learned, it's hard being on the fence because it can be quite painful.
Thank you so much, James, for joining us twice to help us make sense of this story.
It's been a pleasure, as always. Thank you so much.
That's it for our show today. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode of The Global Story, I've got to mention that our show, The Global Story, is also available as a podcast. You can find us every weekday on bbc.com or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.